Hello everybody, welcome back. Jiu-Jitsu 2000 here today. I'm back with an interesting video for you. Today we're going to continue our Phase 1 Pathfinder training certification. We're going to be talking about Block 3, Module 1. We're going to be talking about bleeding and burns today. Now before I get into this great information that I'm about to share, I want to make a couple things very clear. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a nurse. There's nothing on my resume that has anything to do with the medical field. The information that I'm going to be sharing with you in this video today is just that. It's information. It's techniques that I've learned over the years that I may have personally used, or it might be things that I wrote down during my research in this training in my book here, which you're going to see me referencing a lot in this course today. In this video is my journal, my Write in the Rain book. I've taken a lot of notes and I have a lot of good information for you today. Now with that being said, let's get started. Again, we're on Block 3, Module 1, Bleeding and Burns. The first objective of the video today is to talk about several ways to stop bleeding. Now the first couple sequences that I'm going to talk about are in reference to small cuts. Cuts that bleed, but they're not major end of the world cuts. Okay, then we're going to get into some little bit deeper cuts, and then we're going to get into life-threatening cuts. Okay, so the first cut we're going to talk about, we're sitting around camp, yielding our knife around, and we cut the index finger. Okay, we cut the last digit of our index finger, and it's bleeding like crazy. How do we stop the bleeding? Well, something that I personally use, the first technique I want to recommend is coming up with your other hand and going above the cut. So if you're cut right here, go above it. I know you're thinking, okay, how are you above it? You're going down. What I mean by above the cut is closer to your body, okay? So we're going to go to the cut, and we're going to go above the cut, and we're going to just squeeze that limb or that finger. The reason we're squeezing it would be the same equivalent as kinking the water hose. The water will reduce its flow or stop. And that's basically, for the lack of a better description, that's what I'm wanting to do. I'm wanting to squeeze that finger, and that'll stop or slow down the blood flow. And I can look at the wound now and I can kind of analyze what I need to do. That's one technique that I like to use. The second thing that I like to do is, if there is some good, clean, pure, cold water available, I like to have my buddy pour some cold water on my wound. If I don't have a friend available, maybe I can dip it in a river if there's a river. If there's nobody around and there's no river around, then I need to get to my water bottle, which means I have to release that pressure to get my water, to pour my water on the wound. Now one thing I want to make very clear is, when you're pouring cold water on the wound, you want to use water that you would be happy drinking. In other words, you don't want to be pouring bacteria-filled water on an open wound, okay, and making the situation worse. You want good, clean water on that wound. Cleanest water you can find and the coldest water you can find. Now you might be wondering, why does the water need to be cold? The water needs to be cold because what that does is, when you put cold water inside a wound, the capillaries inside that wound tighten. And when they tighten, they naturally reduce the flow of blood. And sometimes that tightening is just enough that you can actually release the pressure with this other hand, and the wound will stop bleeding on its own. Now that's one technique of cold water. Another technique was putting the pressure. Now let's talk about a third one. A third one would be, and I'm looking at it right here, there's a tree right here full of pine sap. If I can get some pine sap, which is a natural antiseptic, and I can pack it into that wound, a lot of times that'll help because it's so sticky and it'll stick to everything. It's like a glue almost, for the lack of a better description. And that pine sap will a lot of times help stop bleeding. I've known myself many times in the past to go, I've been out at camp or something, and I cut my finger. That's the first thing I'll do. I'll pack it full of pine sap, and then I'll run it in the dirt, and I'll put like a dirt bandage on it. If there's any kind of mullein around, and mullein is a plant that has these big leaves, and they're like furry looking leaves. The first year of mullein is just a bunch of leaves, and then the second year crop and further on, they have a large stem that comes up the front, up the middle, and it has on the top of it, it looks like a corn cob. That's what it looks like to me. But it has these big green leafy leaves, and you can wrap mullein around the leaves, the green leaves around your wound. That works pretty good. Like there's one right there, you can see these leaves. They have kind of a furry texture to them. If you look at them, if you pull them off, they look kind of furry. This is mullein, and this can be used as bandages. Again, some of the women would use them when they were menstruating. They would use these, and they feel like velvet or something. It's got a really neat feel to it. But this is mullein. These stalks of the mullein, see there's some on the ground. The first year they grow, they don't have any center stalk. They look just like this guy right here. And then the second year, that's when they get this nice stalk right here that you see. This is a good plant. This is nature's toilet paper, nature's Band-Aid. It's like a spongy kind of material. Just works good. It's good to have. So we talked about cold water. We talked about direct pressure. We talked about packing it full of pine sap. Again, that's a natural antiseptic. And then we talked about wrapping it with mullein. Now, mullein could be considered a sterile dressing because it's a natural plant. It's very clean. You can look at the leaves and tell that they're pretty good. So putting a sterile dressing on a wound is a good thing. We've applied direct pressure. Now let's say, for example, the cut is a little bit larger than a small cut, but it's not yet a life-threatening cut, but it's bleeding pretty good. It's a mediocre type level cut. So we've tried cold water, it's not doing nothing. We've tried packing it full of pine sap, it's not doing nothing, and it's still bleeding. Well, the next thing I want to recommend is taking that cut and raising it above our heart rate, above our heart. The reason we want it above our heart is because it takes more effort for the blood to flow uphill than it does to flow downhill. So raising and elevating that wound, that limb, is going to help stop bleeding. So we want to elevate the wound. Another thing that comes to mind right now, just off the top of my head, is, and it's not even in my book here, is when it comes to stopping bleeding. One thing is critically important, and that is staying calm. Don't panic, because if you panic, oh, I just cut myself, oh crap, and you freak out, what you're doing is the cyclic rate of your heart is increasing. You want to stay calm so the cyclic rate stays lower. When you get too excited and that cyclic rate elevates, that blood is pumping faster and faster. And when you have a cut, you're just sitting there squirting blood out because you're freaking out. Stay calm, your heart rate will stay low, and that cyclic rate will stay low. Therefore, the blood pumping out will be low, if that makes sense to you. That's just something I think about all the time. Again, mullein is a natural resource. It's abundant here where I'm in my neck of the woods. Another thing you could do is, if you have a knife or a blade or a piece of steel, a piece of rock, and you set it in the wound, so let's say you're holding direct pressure and it's just not stopping and it's still bleeding. And now we're on the side between medium severity cut and getting pretty heavy on this severity scale of the cut. You could put your knife in the fire or some sort of metal object and get it hot, and then you could cauterize that wound. Cauterization, and this, you're probably going to laugh when I say this, but when you got a nice hot frying pan and you put a nice big old slab of meat in there and you hear that sizzle, that, you know, that's cauterization right there, folks. What that is that's burning the cut. Basically, you're sealing the juices inside, if you will. So you're cutting, you know, you got this cut and you got the blade of your knife, it's red hot, and you just go psh, and it hurts. It's painful. You're creating a burn, but you're going to stop the bleeding in most cases. Now, would I recommend doing that? That's something you're going to have to make that decision on your own. This is just information that I'm spitting at you. Okay, let's say for some reason it is a major wound. we have the option of putting a tourniquet on the wound. Now the tourniquet, let's say the wound is right here on my forearm. Let's say there's a big old gash right here, and I've tried packing it with sap, I've tried cleaning it with cold water, I've tried putting a direct pressure above the wound, I've tried applying a sterile dressing. Nothing's working, right? I've tried putting mullein leaves on it and it's still bleeding. Then the next step, which could be in some cases a last resort, would be to put a tourniquet on the wound. Tourniquet could be a nice tight lashing with paracord. It could be, you know, the cargo tape. It could be straps here. It could be strips of bandana. It could be strips of a t-shirt, natural cordage, anything like that. But you need it nice and tight around the wound. Now, the thing about a tourniquet is you want the tourniquet below the joint but above the wound. So if the wound was right here on my arm, the tourniquet would need to be applied above the wound but below my elbow joint, and so forth. If the wound was right here on my bicep, it would need to be above the wound but below my shoulder. A lot of cases when you apply a tourniquet in an emergency situation, you're going to lose the limb anyway. So that's why you want to make sure that you go above the wound but below the joint. Now I'm going to read a little bit of stuff here, make sure I'm not missing anything. Yes, good point right here. If there is a foreign object in your arm, you got a piece of metal or a piece of glass or something like that stuck in your arm and it's bleeding out of this area, right? Don't take that foreign object out of the wound. Think of a flat tire, or let's say you just ran over a nail and your tire still has air in it, but you can hear it. You can hear the air leaking. If you pull that nail out of the tire, you're making a bad situation worse because that nail was blocking airflow from leaving the tire and going completely flat, even though it was still leaking. Think about that same scenario in reference to an object stuck in your arm. Okay? You got this big object stuck in your arm. You don't want to remove it because it might be sealing off. It might be reducing the amount of blood that you're going to be losing. So keep that object there. Take both ends from here and push up, and from here and push down towards the object, and then apply a direct pressure type sterile dressing over the wound, including the object. Put a nice sterile dressing over that object, over the wound, everything in its entirety. That should stop the bleeding. Now, let me see. Let's talk about burns now. Let's talk about the degrees of burns. And before I want to talk about the degrees of burns, I want to talk about the layers of skin. Okay? The very first layer of skin that I'm touching right now, the external layer, is what they refer to as epidermis. Underneath the epidermis, I have to look here, is what they refer to as dermis. And the layer of skin beneath the is what they call hypodermis. Hypodermis consists of fat, it consists of blood vessels, and your nerves. Below the hypodermis is your muscle tissue and your bone. Okay, so let's talk about burns now. First degree burns. They're superficial burns. They affect only the epidermis. The burn site appears red and dry. There's no blisters and they're mildly painful. Second degree burns. Partial thickness burns. They affect the epidermis and the dermis. The burn site is red and moist and may be blistered, swollen, and very painful. Third degree burns. What they refer to as full thickness burns. They extend through the dermis and into the hypodermis. Burn site appears patchy in color, ranging from white to brown with a dry, leathery texture because the burn is so deep it causes little or no pain. Now let's talk about fourth degree burns. Fourth degree burns involve the destruction of all layers of your skin, sometimes extending into the muscle or bone. These burns are brown, dry, charred, and almost always painless. Now in any of these cases, like especially third or fourth degree burns, it's very important that you go seek medical treatment immediately. I'm going to go through this pretty quick. First degree burns. Soak in cool water for a few minutes. Apply antibiotic ointment. Cover it with a clean, dry bandage. Take ibuprofen or acetaminophen for pain. Second degree burns. Soak in cool water for several minutes. Apply antibiotic ointment to prevent infection. Cover with a clean, dry, non-stick bandage. Change bandage every day. Make sure hands are clean. Acetaminophen or ibuprofen may help with the pain and or swelling. Third and fourth degree burns. Seek immediate medical help. Go to emergency department. Elevate the burned body part above your heart. Now, seek medical attention if the burn is larger than 3 inches in diameter, located on your face, your hands, your feet, your groin, your buttocks, or over a major joint. So if you got like your whole knees burned, you better go see the doc. Now, one more thing I want to talk about. When it comes to burns, let's say you're wearing some polyester or nylon type clothing and you walk in a fire. Wool and cotton is good because those things aren't going to be as bad. Wool would probably be the best type of clothing if you're going to be around fires. But let's say you're wearing some basketball shorts or some athletic kind of gear and you walk into some fire and that you get burned, right? And that cloth gets stuck to your skin. That clothing has now become a layer of your skin because it's burned into you. Don't remove that clothing. You can remove the drier layers, the loose layers around the wound, but where that clothing is stuck to your skin, don't try to remove that. That, again, that's a patch, that's a seal. That's like taking that nail out of the tire or taking that object out of the wound. If you try to rip that clothing off, you're going to expose that wound, that burn, and you're probably going to make the situation worse because now you're going to open blood flow and all kinds of things are going to happen. Now, it says here that I got to give you a photocopy of my logbook. Here's my logbook. Here's some of my information. That's the treatment of burns. Let's go back a page. This is these Write in the Rain books are really nice. If you don't have one, you should get one. They're pretty cool. So there's some information talking about burns, and then on the bottom section here I'm talking about ways to stop bleeding. There's my wound. Okay, that wound is bleeding, so I need to apply some sort of pressure dressing. So if I can use my bandana, this would be great. So first thing I want to do is I want to try to take this bandana and I'm trying to stay calm because I don't want this thing to bleed. Taking these layers, making a triangle out of it. Then I'm going to roll this thing up together. Hopefully you can see this. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to create an area that has a lot of padding, which would be right here, this area right here. I'm going to lay this area right over the wound, and I'm going to try to tie this thing together. Just like this. Right over that wound. Right there. There's my pressure dressing. Tighten it up a little bit. Don't make it too tight, but you want it tight enough to keep that blood stopped. I would recommend doing like a square knot here with this cloth. Something that looks like this. Okay, so that's covered over my wound. Another option that you can use, okay, so if you have this in your kit, you can slap that on the wound, take this secondary piece, come right over the wound, and use this secondary piece as your cordage, and apply that directly right over the wound, just like we did before. Again, I recommend a square knot. Just like that. There's my square knot, and there's my wound covered. You can see that this thing has a lot of nice pressure on it. Now Now let's go back to my notes real quick, because there's a little bit of information that I want to read to you before I get out of this section. It's talking in reference to when you're applying a pressure dressing. Try to use Vaseline soaked if you can, because if this is a wound and it's bleeding, I'm going to need to change that bandage later. So if I can use some sort of Vaseline, or again, mullein leaves would be nice to place down first, because they'll create like a barrier, that vegetation, you know, it'll create. What I'm trying to get at is, if I put a dry cotton type fabric on here and that blood soaks into that fabric, a lot of times when you change that dressing, you'll pull that fabric off and sometimes you'll reopen that wound. Kind of like what I talked about with burns and your clothing burning to your skin. Kind of the same idea. So if you can find some natural leaves or something like that to put down, that'll create a barrier so that when you take that dressing off, you're not ripping off, you know, when the blood clots inside the cotton and everything kind of becomes one, you're minimizing the ability of it doing that. So it says try to use Vaseline soaked pads if possible. This will help later when you're putting a new bandage on, because if I remove an old dry bandage, I could accidentally remove a clot and the wound could open and bleed again. So I have something like this going on. You could put the knot directly over the wound. The reason you would want to do that is because the knot, again, would apply more pressure over the wound. It's additional pressure right on top of the wound. And that's going to help in reducing its bleeding. So this concludes Block 3, Module 1. We'll see you soon. We're going to be talking about Block 3, Module 2. We're going to talk about bites and stings. We'll see you then.